Watch where you're going, old man.
The grocery cart slammed into the elderly veteran's hip with enough force to send him falling backward, his cane hitting the floor with a loud crack. The war hero, 73 years old, with medals he never wore, survivor of wounds that still hurt in the cold, reached out for something to hold onto, his old hands grabbing nothing but air before his knees gave out. The store fell silent. 20 people stood frozen in their checkout lines, staring at the shaking man lying on the floor, but not one person moved to help. They knew better. The man who had shoved him, a huge man with tattooed arms and a mean smile, stood over his victim with his arms crossed, daring anyone to step in. "Watch where you're going, old man," he said, his voice full of confidence. He had ruled this town for 17 years, controlled every business, every cop, every judge. He believed no one could touch him. But he made one big mistake. He had no idea that the Vietnam veteran's son, a Navy SEAL who had just come home from the Middle East, was about to walk through those automatic doors. Before we begin, tell us where you are watching from, and if this story touches your heart, please subscribe for more true stories of heroes who protect those who cannot protect themselves. The mountain town of Pinewood Ridge sat in a valley where the Rocky Mountains created natural walls on three sides, as if God himself had put his hands around the town to protect it from the outside world. November had painted the trees in shades of orange and brown, the leaves falling as winter approached. The air was sharp and cold, cold enough to see your breath, cold enough to make old bones ache. Main Street was exactly 6 blocks long, lined with buildings built in the 1880s during the silver mining boom, brick walls with wooden trim, painted signs swinging in the mountain wind, big glass windows showing the afternoon sun. It was 3:15 on a Thursday afternoon. Most of the town's 1,200 people were still at work at the lumber mill or at the tourism offices that brought visitors to the hiking trails and ski slopes. The Pinewood Market sat in the center of town, its parking lot half empty except for a few pickup trucks and an old car with veteran license plates. Inside, the bright lights hummed, casting white light over rows of canned food and cereal boxes. The smell of coffee from the store cafe mixed with the smell of cleaning solution on the recently mopped floors. A radio played country music quietly from the manager's office. Everything was normal. Everything was peaceful. The automatic doors opened at 3:17. Jake Cross entered the Pinewood Market, moving with the careful grace of a man who had learned to save his energy in dangerous places. He stood 6 feet tall, thin and strong at 38 years old, with the kind of fitness that came not from gyms but from carrying 80-pound packs through desert mountains. His hair was dark and cut military short, his face clean-shaven and thin, with lines around his eyes from squinting into too many suns in too many countries. He wore regular clothes, worn jeans, a gray shirt, a black jacket, but he moved like what he was, a warrior dressed in civilian clothes for now. His eyes looked over the store in a trained pattern, noting exits, counting people, looking for threats without thinking about it. Old habits. Next to him, moving more slowly, came his father. Thomas Cross was 73 years old and looked every year of it. He stood 5'9", bent slightly from years of favoring his right side where metal pieces had torn through his hip in Vietnam in 1969. His hair was white and thin, combed neatly back from a face covered with lines and age spots. He wore dress pants and a button-down shirt under a wool sweater, even though his son had offered to buy him something warmer. His left hand held a wooden cane with a brass handle, the kind given out by the VA, worn smooth from years of use. His right hand rested lightly on his son's arm, not really for support but for connection. They moved together toward the pharmacy counter at the back of the store. "I can get it myself," Thomas said, his voice rough from years of cigarettes he'd finally quit 20 years ago. "You don't need to watch over me." "Not watching over you," Jake said quietly, his voice low and calm. "Spending time with you." They had come to Pinewood Ridge for a funeral. Jake's mother, Thomas's wife of 48 years, had died 6 months ago and her best friend from childhood had died last week. The funeral had been that morning. Jake had taken emergency leave from his SEAL team based in Virginia Beach, flown into Denver, driven 3 hours into the mountains to stand next to his father at another grave. The old man had cried silently, tears running down his face while the minister spoke words about meeting again in heaven. Jake had stood straight in his service dress uniform, one hand on his father's shoulder, remembering his mother's smile. Now they needed to refill his father's medicine before the 6-hour drive back to Denver, where Thomas lived in a small apartment filled with photographs of his wife. The pharmacy was at the back corner of the store, past the fruit section and the dairy coolers. They moved slowly, matching Thomas's pace. The old man's hip always hurt more when the weather got cold. Jake noticed his father wince with every third step, saw him put more weight on the cane. He said nothing. His father's pride was real and hard-earned and carefully protected. Jake Cross, a woman's voice, surprised and warm. Jake turned. A woman in her 60s stood near the fruit section, her face lighting up with recognition. She wore a cashier's vest with a name tag that read Margaret. Her hair was gray and pulled back in a simple style, her face lined but kind. Margaret Hoffman, Jake said, his serious look softening slightly. I didn't know you still worked here. 32 years at this register, she said, moving closer. She had been his fourth-grade teacher before she retired from teaching to work part-time at the market. I heard about Helen, I'm so sorry. She looked at Thomas. Mr. Cross, she was a wonderful woman. Thank you, Thomas said quietly, his hand tightening slightly on Jake's arm. They talked for a few moments, small town talk, memories of Jake's mother, questions about Jake's work that he avoided with practice skill. Margaret asked if they were staying in town. Jake explained they were leaving after picking up the medicine. She nodded, squeezed his hand, told them to drive safely. Then she glanced toward the front of the store and something changed in her face. Fear showed for just a second. You should get what you need and go, she said quietly. Her eyes moved past Jake to the entrance. He's here. Jake followed her look. The man who entered the Pinewood Market at 3:28 filled the doorway like a storm coming. He stood 6'4" and weighed about 250 pounds, most of it muscle gone a little soft in middle age but still big, still dangerous. He was 53 years old, with a thick neck, broad shoulders, and arms that strained his expensive leather jacket sleeves. His face was heavy and red, with small eyes set deep under a thick brow, a wide nose that had been broken at least twice, and a mouth that seemed always fixed in a mean look. His hair was dark and slicked back with too much gel, showing where his hairline went back. He wore designer jeans, Italian leather boots, and gold rings on 4 fingers. He moved like a man who had never been told no. Behind him came 2 other men. One was younger, maybe 35, thin and mean-looking with a shaved head and a prison tattoo going up his neck. The other was older, mid-40s, wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform. The deputy's hand rested on his gun belt as his eyes looked over the store, and Jake recognized the body language, not a cop but a bodyguard, muscle with a badge. The big man's name was Derek Kane. He had owned Pinewood Ridge for 17 years. He owned the lumber mill that gave jobs to half the town. He owned the real estate company that rented out tourist cabins. He owned the bar, the gas station, and the small casino that worked in gray legal areas just outside town limits. He owned the mayor, the sheriff, and the county judge. He owned the silence that fell over the store as he entered, the way people suddenly became very interested in their shopping lists, the way Margaret Hoffman's face went pale, and she hurried back to her register without another word. Derek Kane ruled through fear and money and connections that reached to the state capitol. Anyone who stood against him lost their business, their home, their freedom. Anyone who challenged him disappeared from Pinewood Ridge one way or another. The smart ones left quietly. The stubborn ones were destroyed. There had been federal investigations twice. Both times the investigators had left with nothing, witnesses taking back their statements, evidence mysteriously lost. Kane moved through the store like he was checking his property. He grabbed a bottle of expensive whiskey from the liquor section without looking at the price, picked up a few other items without any real reason. He was killing time, showing his presence, reminding everyone who controlled their lives. His eyes moved over the customers with casual hate. Then those eyes landed on Thomas Cross, and something mean showed in them. The old veteran stood near the pharmacy counter, reading his medicine bottles with the careful attention of someone whose eyes weren't what they used to be. His cane leaned against the counter next to him. Jake stood 3 feet away, watching the pharmacist count pills behind the glass wall, his back to the rest of the store. Neither man noticed Kane coming closer. Well, look at this, Kane's voice boomed across the store, loud enough to make people jump. We got ourselves a veteran in here, a real American hero. His tone was full of mockery. Thomas looked up, his face neutral. His generation had learned not to seek attention, not to make waves. He had received his Purple Heart and Bronze Star in ceremonies where he was the only one who showed up. He had never told anyone in Pinewood Ridge about his service. He didn't know how Derek Kane knew. Kane moved closer, his boots heavy on the floor. The deputy and the tattooed man walked beside him like trained dogs. You were in Vietnam, right? I can always tell you got that look, that broken look. He laughed, and his friends echoed it. My old man was in Vietnam too, came back all messed up, crying in his sleep, jumping at car backfires, pathetic. I always wondered what kind of man lets a war break him. Jake turned slowly. His face didn't change, but his body language shifted into something coiled, ready. His eyes fixed on Kane with the flat, watching look of a hunter checking out prey. That's enough, Jake said quietly. Just 2 words said in a tone that had made hardened terrorists rethink their life choices. Kane's eyes shifted to Jake, seeing him for the first time. And who the hell are you?
His son.
His son, Kane repeated, drawing out the words mockingly. He looked Jake up and down, taking in the military bearing, the controlled stillness, the dangerous skill. Something told Kane this man wasn't local, wasn't controllable, wasn't afraid. It made him angry. You got something to say to me, boy.
Leave him alone.
Kane's face got redder. This is my town. I say what I want to whoever I want. You don't like it, you can get the hell out. He turned back to Thomas, dismissing Jake completely. You know what I think? I think all you Vietnam vets are just looking for sympathy. That war was 50 years ago. Nobody cares anymore. Time to stop playing the victim. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had heard worse. He had survived worse. Words couldn't hurt him, but his hand shook slightly as he set down his medicine bottle. Kane saw the shaking. His smile got wider. Look at that. Old man can't even hold a bottle steady, probably faking that too, trying to get disability checks. I see it all the time, losers pretending to be hurt so they don't have to work. Step back, Jake said. His voice hadn't gotten louder, hadn't changed tone, but something in it made the deputy's hand move closer to his gun. Kane ignored him. He reached out with one thick finger and poked Thomas in the chest, hard enough to make the old man rock back on his heels. I asked you a question, old man. You faking that limp? You really hurt, or you just milking the system? Jake moved one step forward, placing himself between Kane and his father. Last warning, he said softly. Walk away. Or what? Kane leaned in close, his breath hot and whiskey sour. You gonna do something? You think you're tough? I've been running this town since before you could shave. I've broken bigger men than you. He raised his voice so the whole store could hear. You know what happens to people who threaten me? Ask around. Ask what happened to Michael Chen when he tried to report me for code violations. Ask where Rebecca Walsh ended up when she testified about my business practices. Oh wait, you can't ask Rebecca, because she left town so fast she forgot to pack. He was close now, close enough that Jake could smell the whiskey and cologne, close enough to see the burst blood vessels in Kane's nose, the gold caps on his back teeth, the absolute certainty in his eyes that he would face no consequences. My son's got PTSD or something, Kane announced to the store. Real hair trigger, you never know when these military types are gonna snap, probably hopped up on pills from the VA, dangerous. That's what I'll tell the sheriff when I press charges for threatening me. The deputy nodded, already pulling out a notepad. I heard him threaten you, Derek, clear as day. Jake didn't move, didn't react. He simply stood there, a wall between Kane and his father, his hands loose at his sides, his breathing controlled. He had learned patience in harder places than this. He could wait, he could be still. But Kane wanted a reaction. He needed submission or violence, either one would work. When Jake gave him neither, Kane's anger spiked into rage. He looked past Jake to Thomas, who stood with one hand on the pharmacy counter, trying to stay standing without his cane. You know what your problem is, old man? Kane's voice rose to a shout. You're weak, you're used up, you're worthless, you're taking up space and air that real Americans could use. You and every other broken-down veteran who thinks they're special because they put on a uniform 50 years ago. Nobody cares, nobody ever cared. You got shot because you were stupid and slow, and now you want the rest of us to pay for your mistakes forever. The store was completely silent. Margaret Hoffman had tears running down her face. A young mother covered her child's ears. An elderly man in the fruit section stared at his shoes, ashamed of his own paralysis. Everyone knew this was wrong. Everyone knew someone should stop it. No one moved. Kane's hand shot out, reaching past Jake to grab Thomas's sweater. But Jake's hand moved faster, catching Kane's wrist mid-motion, his grip like iron. For just a second their eyes met, and Kane saw something that made his breath catch, a cold, absolute certainty of violence, held back by discipline but ready to be let loose. Then Kane made his fatal mistake. He shoved Thomas anyway. His free hand, the one Jake hadn't caught, shot out and hit the old man's shoulder. Thomas, already off balance without his cane, stumbled backward. His hip, the one that had been rebuilt with steel pins after a mortar round tore it apart in 1969, buckled. He fell hard, his head cracking against the edge of the pharmacy counter on the way down, his body falling to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. The sound echoed through the store, the sick crack of skull on wood, the heavy thump of an old body hitting the floor, the gasping sound as air left Thomas's lungs. For 3 seconds no one breathed, the world stopped. Thomas lay on his side, his eyes squeezed shut, his face gray with pain. Blood began to leak from a cut on his head, bright red against his white hair. His breathing was shallow and fast. His hands grabbed at nothing. Jake dropped to his knees next to his father instantly, his training taking over. His hands moved with practiced speed, checking for spine injury, looking at the head wound, feeling for broken bones. Dad, stay still, don't move, I've got you. His voice was calm, controlled, but his hands were gentle, so gentle as they checked his father's injuries. I'm okay, Thomas wheezed. I'm okay, son, I've had worse. I know you have, but you're going to let me check anyway. Jake's fingers found the wound on his father's head, surface level, bloody but not deep. He checked his father's pupils, responsive, good. He felt along the hip that had taken the worst of the fall. Thomas hissed in pain, probably bruised, maybe cracked, but nothing obviously broken. Can you tell me what day it is? Thursday, November, stop fussing. Jake helped his father sit up slowly, supporting his weight, moving him carefully against the base of the pharmacy counter. He took off his jacket and folded it under his father's head. Then, and only then, did he stand and turn to face Derek Kane. The change in Jake's face was subtle but complete. The worried son disappeared. What stood up was something else entirely, something that had killed men in 12 different countries, something that had learned to function in the worst places on earth, something that had been made in violence and hardened in blood. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. You made a mistake. Kane laughed, but it sounded forced. Yeah, what are you gonna do about it? You saw it, he fell. Old man lost his balance. These witnesses will say the same thing. He looked around the store, his eyes promising consequences to anyone who disagreed. Won't you folks? Silence, fear. But three people Kane didn't know were there, had their phones out recording. A tourist couple from Denver in the frozen food section. A young man with headphones who'd been looking at magazines. They had captured everything. The shove, the fall, the blood, the threat. Jake reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out his phone. He dialed a number from memory. This is Lieutenant Jake Cross, SEAL Team 3. I need to report an assault on a veteran and possible ongoing corruption investigation in Pinewood Ridge, Colorado, requesting federal assistance. He gave details, location, time, number of witnesses, injuries. His voice was professional, clinical, empty of emotion. It was the voice of a man filing a report, documenting evidence, building a case. Kane's smile faded. You think the FBI is gonna come running because some old man fell down? You're dumber than you look. We'll see. The automatic doors opened, and Sheriff Wade Porter entered with two more deputies. Porter was 60 years old, overweight and red-faced, with a mustache yellowed from tobacco and eyes that had learned to look away from injustice. He wore his uniform like armor and his badge like a weapon. He took in the scene with one glance and made his decision before hearing a single word. What's going on here? His question was directed at Kane, not Jake. These two came in making trouble, Kane said smoothly. The old man got aggressive with me, tried to take a swing, lost his balance and fell. His son here threatened me, made terrorist statements about federal response. Probably need to detain him for questioning. Could be a domestic extremist situation. Porter nodded as if this made perfect sense. He gestured to his deputies. Take the young one into custody, threatening behavior, potential assault. That's not what happened, Margaret Hoffman's voice rang out, shaking but clear. She stood behind her register, her hands gripping the counter for support. Derek shoved Mr. Cross. I saw it, we all saw it. Porter's eyes went hard. Margaret, you must be mistaken. Mr. Kane is a respected businessman. I'm sure you're confused about what you saw. I'm not confused. He attacked an elderly veteran. There's blood on the floor. Head wounds bleed a lot doesn't mean anything. Porter moved toward Jake, his hand resting on his taser. Son, I'm going to need you to come with me. We'll get this sorted out at the station. Jake didn't move. He stood over his father like a guardian, his stance balanced, ready. My father needs medical attention. Call an ambulance. Then you can review the footage from your store cameras before you make any arrests. Porter's jaw clenched. This store doesn't have working cameras. System's been broken for months. Now, are you going to come peacefully, or do we need to do this the hard way? Call an ambulance first. Boy, I'm not asking. Call an ambulance. The two men stared at each other. The deputies moved closer, hands on their weapons. Kane watched with a smile, enjoying the show. The store held its breath. Then Thomas's voice cut through the tension. Jake, go with them, I'm fine, Margaret will help me. Dad, I'm giving you an order, sailor, stand down. Jake's jaw worked. Every instinct screamed at him to stay, to protect, to fight. But his father's voice carried the tone of command that had once sent young men into battle. After a long moment, Jake nodded once. Yes, sir. He let Porter handcuff him, didn't resist as they led him toward the door. But as he passed Derek Kane, he stopped, looked the bigger man directly in the eyes. This isn't over. Kane laughed. Yeah, it is. This is my town. You're going to spend the night in a cell, and by tomorrow you'll be so eager to leave you'll forget this ever happened. They all do. Jake said nothing. He simply held Kane's gaze for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then the deputies pulled him away and he was gone. Kane watched them go, his smile victorious. He looked down at Thomas, who sat slumped against the pharmacy counter, blood drying in his white hair. "You should have raised your boy better, taught him some respect." He turned to his friends. "Let's go, I'm done here." As they left, Kane pulled out his phone. He had calls to make. The mayor needed to know about this incident. The judge needed to be ready with charges. The local news needed the right story. Within an hour, everyone in Pinewood Ridge would know that an out-of-town troublemaker had assaulted beloved businessman Derek Kane and was now safely behind bars. What Kane didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Jake Cross's phone call hadn't gone to a local FBI office. It had gone to a satellite phone in Quantico, Virginia, where a federal task force had been building a case against Kane for 14 months. They'd been waiting for a catalyst, for someone who couldn't be scared, for evidence that could stick. They'd been waiting for someone exactly like Jake Cross. The dominoes were starting to fall. Kane just didn't know it yet. The Pinewood Ridge Sheriff's Station was a small brick building on 2nd Street, 2 blocks from the grocery store. It held 4 cells, a processing area, a break room that smelled like burnt coffee, and Sheriff Porter's office with its dusty blinds and wall covered in certificates of appreciation from the Kane Foundation. Jake sat in the first cell, his wrists free now, his body relaxed on the steel bench but his mind working through scenarios and possibilities. It was 6 o'clock, 3 hours since the arrest. He'd been booked on charges of threatening behavior, disturbing the peace, and assaulting an officer. The last charge was completely made up, but Deputy Harris had sworn Jake grabbed his wrist during the arrest. Jake had said nothing during processing, offered no explanations, signed nothing, and asked for his lawyer exactly once. They'd ignored the request. His father was in the hospital. Margaret Hoffman had texted that information to Jake's phone before Porter took it away. Thomas had been diagnosed with a concussion, severe bruising to his hip, and they were keeping him overnight for observation. Margaret had stayed with him. Jake held onto that information like an anchor. His father was safe, being cared for. That meant Jake could focus on what came next. He had been in worse cells, in Kandahar, in Iraq, in Syria during an operation that officially never happened. He knew how to wait, how to think, how to plan. The door to the cell block opened at 6:15. A woman entered, moving quietly, her eyes darting to check for cameras before she came to Jake's cell. She was mid-40s, wearing the uniform of a sheriff's dispatcher, dress pants, button-down shirt, radio on her hip. Her name tag read Sarah Mills. She had brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, tired eyes, and the look of someone who had been carrying a heavy secret for far too long. "Lieutenant Cross," her voice was barely above a whisper. Jake stood, moved to the bars. "Yes. I'm Sarah Mills, I work here." She glanced back at the door again. "I don't have much time. Porter went to dinner with Kane. I have maybe 15 minutes. "I'm listening." "I know what happened at the market. I know what Derek Kane did to your father. I know because I've been watching him do things like that for 7 years since I started working here, and I've been collecting evidence because I knew someday someone would come along who wasn't afraid of him." She reached into her shirt pocket and pulled out a USB drive, small and black. "This has everything: dispatch recordings of calls that were never filed, reports that were buried, financial records showing payments from Kane to Porter, names of victims, dates, amounts, everything." Jake took the drive carefully, closed his fist around it. "Why now?" "Because you called the feds, because you're military and they can't just make you disappear like the others, because," her voice broke slightly, "because my brother was one of those others. Michael Chen, he owned a restaurant. He found out Kane was laundering money through his business accounts, using them without permission. When Michael threatened to report it, Kane had him arrested on drug charges, planted evidence. Michael went to prison for 4 years. He got out 3 months ago, moved to California. Won't even talk to me anymore because I still work here. And he thinks I betrayed him by not speaking up." "Why didn't you?" "Because I have a daughter, she's 12. Kane made it very clear what would happen to her if I said anything. He didn't threaten directly, he's too smart for that, but his son goes to her school, his people are everywhere, I couldn't risk it." Tears ran down her face. "But you're different, you're not local, you have resources, you called people who can actually stop him. So I'm giving you this and I'm praying it's enough and I'm begging you to keep my name out of it until he's already arrested." "Tell me about his operation." Sarah glanced at the door again, then spoke quickly. "Kane owns a casino just outside town limits, the Silver Pine Lodge. It's licensed for low-stakes gambling, but there's a back room where the real money changes hands. High-stakes poker, sports betting, everything illegal. He's running $5 million a year through there, cash only, no records. He launders it through his other businesses, the lumber mill, the real estate company, the rental properties. He bribes Porter, the mayor, Judge Morrison, half the county commissioners. Anyone who crosses him gets destroyed. He has records on everyone, leverage on everyone. He's been doing it for 17 years and no one's ever touched him." "Where does he keep his records?" "His home office, big house on Ridge Road up in the hills." Security system cameras, usually 2 guys on site, but the office is in the basement and the evidence is in a fireproof safe behind a painting of his father. Combination is his wife's birthday, 072275. She told me once when she was drunk. She hates him. Wishes she'd left 20 years ago, but he owns everything in her name and she'd lose her kids in the divorce. Jake processed this information rapidly. Will she testify? Maybe, if he's already arrested and she feels safe. Her name is Diane. She volunteers at the library on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She's a good person trapped in a bad situation. How long before Porter gets back? 20 minutes, maybe 30 if they're drinking. Sarah backed toward the door. I gave you everything I can, the rest is up to you. Just please make this mean something. Make my brother's 4 years in prison mean something, make all of it matter. It will, I promise. She left as quietly as she'd come, and Jake was alone with the USB drive and a plan forming in his mind. He had evidence now. He had names and places. He had the combination to a safe. What he needed next was time, freedom, and a way to gather proof that would stand up in federal court. The phone call he'd made from the grocery store had gone to Special Agent Marcus Webb of the FBI's Public Corruption Task Force. Webb was former Marine Corps, 48 years old, and had been building RICO cases for 15 years. He had been investigating Kane since a banker in Denver noticed suspicious transaction patterns and filed a federal report. Webb's team had been working slowly, carefully, trying to build an airtight case against a target who had avoided prosecution twice before. They'd been stuck for months, unable to get anyone local to testify, unable to get concrete evidence. Jake's call had been a gift from heaven. Webb had immediately authorized surveillance and documentation. Even now, federal agents were probably reviewing the footage that tourists had uploaded to social media, because of course the videos had gone viral within hours. Navy SEAL's father attacked by local businessman was trending in Colorado. The pressure was building. Kane didn't know it yet, but his empire was starting to crack. Jake sat back on the bench and closed his eyes. He reviewed everything he knew, organizing information the way he'd been trained, building a mental map of the battlefield. Kane's home, the casino, the network of corruption, the witnesses, the evidence, the timeline. He needed 48 hours, maybe 72, long enough for Webb's team to arrive, for warrants to be issued, for the trap to be set properly. All he had to do was stay alive and keep his father safe until then. At 7 o'clock, Sheriff Porter returned, his face flushed with whiskey and anger. He opened Jake's cell door and stood there, one hand on his gun. You got a visitor. Against my better judgment, 5 minutes. Jake followed him to a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs. Sitting in one of them, looking somehow both fragile and fierce, was his father. Thomas Cross had a white bandage wrapped around his head. His skin was pale and he moved stiffly, but his eyes were clear and sharp. He waited until Porter left and closed the door before speaking. You got me worried, sons. Dad, you should be in the hospital. Checked myself out, they wanted to keep me overnight, but I told them I had somewhere to be. Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping. Now you listen to me. I was in this town 30 years ago when your mother and I first got married. We lived here for 2 years before we moved to Denver. I know things, I know people, and I know Derek Kane. Dad. Let me finish. Kane's father, Robert, was a good man, owned the lumber mill, gave people fair wages, took care of the town. When he died in 1997, Derek took over and everything changed. He started cutting corners, scaring competitors, buying politicians. There was a man named Joseph Palmer. He was Robert's best friend, co-owner of the mill. When Joseph objected to Derek's methods, Derek bought out his share using money from somewhere Joseph couldn't trace, then sued him for breach of contract. Joseph lost everything, had to sell his home, move away. Last I heard, he was living in a VA facility in Grand Junction. He was a Marine, Vietnam, same as me. Jake leaned forward. You think he'd testify? If someone asked him properly, if he knew it mattered, if he knew Kane was finally going to face consequences. Thomas reached across the table and gripped his son's hand. There's more. Kane has a business partner, a man named Vincent Russo. He's the silent money behind the casino, organized crime connections out of Chicago. If you're building a case, you need to know about Russo. He's the one who taught Kane how to do all this. How do you know all this? Because I never stopped being a soldier. I kept my eyes open. I listened. And when your mother and I visited every year for memorial services and old friends' funerals, I watched how this town changed. I watched good people leave and bad ones take over. I've been waiting for someone to care enough to stop it. Looks like that someone is you. Jake squeezed his father's hand. Get somewhere safe. Margaret's house maybe. Stay there until this is over. I'm not hiding. Dad. I said I'm not hiding. I'm 73 years old. I survived a war and cancer and losing your mother. I'm not going to let some 2-bit criminal make me hide in my old age. Besides, you need me. I know this town. I know who might help and who's compromised. You can't do this alone. They looked at each other across the table. Two generations of warriors, stubborn and proud and absolutely certain. Okay, Jake said finally, but you follow my orders. When I say move, you move. When I say hide, you hide, understood? Oh, yes, sir. Porter opened the door, time's up. Thomas stood slowly, favoring his injured hip. As he passed Jake, he whispered, "There's a woman named Linda Hayes. She runs the library. She's been collecting newspaper articles about Kane for 20 years. Her husband was a state trooper who died investigating Kane's business. Hit and run that was never solved. She'll help you." Then he was gone, and Jake was alone again. That night, Jake didn't sleep. He sat in his cell and ran through scenarios, calculated risks, planned approaches. At 2 in the morning, the door to the cell block opened again. This time it was Deputy Marcus Harris, the young deputy with the neck tattoo who had helped Kane at the grocery store. He unlocked Jake's cell and stepped inside. "Get up," Harris said. "Kane wants to talk to you." "Not interested." Harris's hand moved to his baton. Wasn't a request. Jake stood slowly, evaluating. Harris was younger, aggressive, used to scaring people who couldn't fight back. He carried himself like someone who'd done prison time. His eyes had that flat, emotionless quality that came from violence normalized. "Turn around," Harris ordered, "hands behind your back." Jake complied, let Harris handcuff him roughly. They walked through the station, empty at this hour except for the night dispatcher, who carefully looked at her computer screen and saw nothing. Harris shoved Jake into the back of a patrol car and drove out of town, heading up into the hills. This was bad, this was very bad. But Jake had been in bad situations before. He'd been captured in Mosul, held for 36 hours in a basement that smelled like death, questioned by men who enjoyed their work. He'd gotten out. He'd survived. He could do it again. The car stopped at a construction site, one of Kane's development projects, a luxury home half-built and abandoned for the winter. Harris pulled Jake out of the car and pushed him toward the unfinished structure. Inside, portable lights lit up bare wooden beams and concrete floors. Derek Kane stood in the center of the space, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up. Two other men flanked him, the tattooed man from the store and another enforcer Jake hadn't seen before. "Lieutenant Jake Cross," Kane said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Navy SEAL Team 3, 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, 3 deployments, impressive record. You've killed people, haven't you? In the line of duty, of course." Jake said nothing. "I've killed people too," Kane continued. "Not in war, just business. People who got in my way, people who threatened what I built. I've made 13 bodies disappear over the last 15 years. Every single one of them thought they were smart enough to beat me. Every single one was wrong." He moved closer, his bulk blocking the light. "Here's how this works. You're going to stand up in front of Judge Morrison tomorrow morning. You're going to plead guilty to assault and threatening behavior. You're going to accept 30 days in county jail and a $5,000 fine. You're going to tell the judge you were suffering from PTSD, you lost control, you're deeply sorry. Then you're going to serve your time, and when you get out, you're going to take your broken father and leave Colorado and never come back. And if you ever speak about what happened to anyone, I will have your father killed. Not quickly, slowly, painfully, and you'll know it was your fault." Jake looked at him steadily. "No." Kane's face darkened. "What?" "I said no, I'm not pleading guilty, I'm not leaving. And you're not going to hurt my father." "You stupid," Kane's hand shot out, grabbing Jake by the throat, slamming him against a concrete pillar. "Do you know who I am? Do you understand what I can do?" "I know exactly who you are," Jake said calmly, despite the hand crushing his windpipe. "You're a criminal, you're a bully, and you're about to lose everything." Kane squeezed harder. Jake's vision began to narrow, dark spots creeping in. But he didn't struggle, didn't panic. He'd been choked before. He knew how long he could last. Then a voice cut through the darkness. "Derek, let him go." Everyone turned. A woman stood in the doorway, elegant, expensive, with highlighted blonde hair and designer clothes that screamed money. She was 52 years old but looked 40, with the kind of maintenance that came from personal trainers and plastic surgeons. She held a phone in her hand, the screen glowing. "Diane Keynes." "Diane," Derek released Jake, confusion replacing anger. "What are you doing here?" "I followed you. I've been following you for months, actually. Ever since I hired a private investigator to document your affairs and your crimes so I could divorce you without ending up penniless." She held up the phone. "I've been recording this entire conversation, all of it, the confession about the 13 bodies, the threats against this man's father, everything, and I've already uploaded it to a cloud server, and I've sent copies to my lawyer, my therapist, and the FBI." The construction site went absolutely silent. "You," Kane's voice was a whisper of rage and disbelief. "You recorded me." I recorded you threatening to murder an elderly veteran. I recorded you confessing to 13 murders. I recorded you trying to force a federal witness. Diane looked at Jake. Sarah Mills called me yesterday, told me what you did at the grocery store, told me someone was finally standing up to Derek. She asked if I'd help. I said yes. I'm done being afraid of you. I'm done pretending I don't see what you are. Kane took a step toward her, his hands curling into fists. Diane, if I think what, that you'll hurt me, here, now, with witnesses, with everything recorded, she smiled, and it was the saddest smile Jake had ever seen. I've already filed for divorce. I've already moved our sons out of state. I've already talked to the FBI. You can't touch me anymore. You can't touch any of us. For the first time since Jake had met him, Derek Kane looked uncertain. His empire of fear was crumbling, and he could feel it happening but couldn't stop it. Deputy Harris took a step backward. Mr. Kane, I didn't sign up for this. I thought we were just... Shut up, Kane snarled, then to his wife, you'll regret this. No, Diane said softly, I regret not doing it sooner. I regret all the people you hurt while I stayed silent. I regret my cowardice, but I don't regret this. This is the first good thing I've done in 20 years. She walked to Jake and produced a handcuff key, unlocking his restraints. I'm sorry about your father. I'm sorry about all of this. If you need anything, testimony, evidence, whatever, you have my number. Sarah gave it to you with everything else. Jake rubbed his wrists. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. He's not beaten until he's in handcuffs. Diane looked at her husband with something like pity. Goodbye, Derek. I hope you find peace in prison. God knows you never found it here. She left, her heels clicking on the concrete, her back straight and proud. Kane stood frozen, his world ending, his control shattered. Then his rage erupted. Get him, he screamed at his men. Kill him now. But Harris was already running for the door. The other two enforcers looked at each other, calculated their odds against a Navy SEAL, and decided they were done. They ran too. That left Jake and Kane alone in the unfinished house. This isn't over, Kane hissed. Yes, Jake said quietly, it is. He walked out, leaving Kane alone in his half-built empire, and didn't look back. Outside, Jake found Harris's patrol car still running. He got in and drove back to town, called Special Agent Webb on his confiscated phone that Harris had left in the glove box, and reported everything. Webb told him to sit tight. The team was coming. Warrants were being issued. It was happening. Jake drove to the hospital, checked on his father, sleeping peacefully now, his breathing steady, and then went to find somewhere to wait for dawn. In her home across town, Diane Kane sat at her kitchen table and cried for the first time in years. Relief, terror, freedom, grief, all of it poured out at once. On the table in front of her sat 17 years of documentation, photographs, recordings, financial statements, love letters to mistresses, evidence of bribes and threats and crimes she'd witnessed but never reported. She'd been collecting it all, waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right chance. That chance had come in the form of a grocery store attack on an elderly veteran and his Navy SEAL son. Sometimes God worked in mysterious ways. At the sheriff's station, Sarah Mills deleted the dispatch recording of Kane's call to have Jake taken to the construction site. She deleted the log of Harris taking Jake out. She deleted all traces of the corruption she'd been forced to enable. Then she went home to her daughter, hugged her tight, and promised her that things were going to get better now. In the unfinished construction site, Derek Kane sat on the concrete floor and tried to understand how his perfect system had failed. How his empire of fear had crumbled in less than 24 hours. How one man, one quiet, capable man, had done what federal investigators, state police, and local heroes had failed to do for 17 years. He didn't understand that it wasn't just one man. It was Sarah Mills finding her courage. It was Diane Kane finding her conscience. It was Margaret Hoffman standing up at the grocery store. It was 3 tourists with phones recording what they saw. It was a dozen people who had been hurt by Kane finally seeing someone who wouldn't be scared, who couldn't be bought, who would stand up and fight. Jake Cross hadn't defeated Derek Kane alone. He'd been the catalyst that let good people remember they could be brave. Morning came to Pinewood Ridge with frost glittering on the streets and sunlight turning the peaks gold. It was Friday, November 6th, and the town woke to rumors spreading like wildfire. Derek Kane's wife had left him. A Navy SEAL was in custody. Federal agents were in town. The grocery store attack video had been viewed 4 million times. Something was happening, something big. At 9 o'clock, the town square began to fill with people. It was Veterans Day weekend, and the annual ceremony was scheduled for 10 a.m. every year. Pinewood Ridge honored its veterans with speeches and wreaths and promises of gratitude. Every year, Derek Kane stood on the platform as a patriotic businessman and made a speech about sacrifice and service. Every year, people applauded while privately resenting him. This year would be different. Jake stood at the back of the crowd, his father next to him. Thomas had checked himself out of the hospital against doctor's orders, determined to see this through. His head was still bandaged, his hip screamed with every step, but he stood straight and proud in his old service uniform, the one that still fit barely after 50 years. His medals gleamed on his chest. Margaret Hoffman was there, standing with 10 other grocery store employees, all of them wearing buttons that read, "I saw what happened." Linda Hayes from the library stood near the platform with a stack of folders, her 20 years of documentation about Kane's crimes. Sarah Mills stood with her daughter, both of them watching nervously. Diane Kane sat in her car at the edge of the square, window cracked, recording. And in the crowd, dressed as regular people, were 8 federal agents. Special Agent Marcus Webb stood near the sound booth, watching everything with the patient attention of a hunter waiting for exactly the right moment. At 9:55, Derek Kane arrived. He pulled up in his BMW, got out with his usual swagger, wearing an expensive suit and an American flag pin. He climbed the steps to the platform, nodded to the mayor, who looked distinctly uncomfortable and prepared to give his speech. He was smiling, confident. He didn't know that his wife had handed the FBI 17 years of evidence. He didn't know that Sarah Mills had given them dispatch recordings. He didn't know that 11 people in the crowd were prepared to testify. He thought he was untouchable. He thought this was just another day in his kingdom. The ceremony began with the national anthem. Everyone stood, hands over hearts, while a recording played from the speakers. Then the mayor stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for gathering today to honor our veterans." The mayor spoke for 5 minutes about service and sacrifice, his voice shaking slightly, sweat visible on his forehead despite the cold. He kept glancing at Kane, at the crowd, at the federal agents he'd finally spotted. He knew. Somehow he knew it was over. Then it was Kane's turn. He approached the microphone with his usual arrogance, looked out over the crowd, and began to speak. "My fellow citizens, we gather today to honor those who served our great nation. Men and women who put their lives on the line." "That's enough." The voice came from the back of the crowd. Sarah Mills stepped forward, her daughter's hand in hers, her face pale but determined. She held up her phone, the screen showing a recording. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sarah Mills. I worked for the sheriff's department, and I have something you all need to hear." She pressed play. Kane's voice filled the square, recorded the night before at the construction site. "I've killed people too, not in war, just business. People who got in my way. I've made 13 bodies disappear over the last 15 years. The crowd gasped. Kane's face went white, then red. That's fake, that's been edited, she's lying." "I'm not lying." Diane Kane stepped out of her car, her phone also raised. "And I have the full recording, everything, the threats, the confessions, the coercion, all of it." Linda Hayes stepped forward with her folders. "And I have 20 years of newspaper articles, police reports, and witness statements documenting Derek Kane's criminal enterprise. Names, dates, victims, all documented." Margaret Hoffman raised her phone. "And I have video from yesterday, the assault in the grocery store, the attack on Thomas Cross, all recorded." One by one, people stepped forward. A woman who'd lost her business, a man who'd been falsely arrested, a couple who'd been driven from town, a retired cop who'd been forced to look the other way. Victim after victim, witness after witness, all of them finally finding their voices. Kane stood frozen on the platform, his empire crumbling around him in real time. "You can't all Porter, Sheriff Porter, arrest these people. They're making false accusations." But Sheriff Porter was backing away, his hands raised. "I'm not part of this, I don't know anything about." "You took bribes," Sarah shouted. "I have the records, the payments, everything." Special Agent Marcus Webb stepped forward, his FBI credentials held high. "Derek Kane, you're under arrest for racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, bribery of public officials, and assault. Sheriff Wade Porter, you're also under arrest as a co-conspirator." Behind him, federal agents moved through the crowd like a coordinated machine. They surrounded the platform, weapons drawn, badges visible. A helicopter appeared over the ridge, its rotors thundering. 3 black SUVs pulled into the square, more agents spilling out. Kane tried to run. He made it 3 steps before 2 agents tackled him, forcing him to the ground. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. They hauled him to his feet, and for the first time in 17 years, Derek Kane looked small, powerless, defeated. "You have the right to remain silent," Webb recited. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Kane's eyes found Jake in the crowd. Hate burned in them, mixed with disbelief. How had this happened? How had one man brought down his entire empire? But Jake's eyes held no triumph, no satisfaction, just cold certainty, justice. Porter was arrested next, then the mayor, then Judge Morrison, who'd arrived late and tried to leave early. The corrupt Deputy Harris was found hiding in his car and taken into custody. One by one, the corrupt officials were handcuffed, read their rights, and led to the waiting vehicles. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the arrests continued. Then someone started clapping, then another, then another. Soon the entire square erupted in applause, tears streaming down faces, people hugging each other. 17 years of fear and oppression finally lifted. Webb approached Jake and Thomas. "Lieutenant Cross, Mr. Cross, thank you. Without your courage yesterday, without that phone call, we might never have gotten this opportunity." "It wasn't just us," Jake said, gesturing to the crowd. "It was everyone. They just needed someone to believe in." "Still, you started it. You gave them hope." Webb shook both their hands. "We'll need your statements, but that can wait until tomorrow. Today, you should be with your father, and these people should celebrate their freedom." As the federal vehicles pulled away, Kane in the back of one of them looking through the window at the town he'd terrorized for so long, the crowd surged forward. People wanted to shake Jake's hand, to thank Thomas, to hug Sarah and Diane and Margaret. They wanted to tell their stories, to cry, to laugh, to feel safe for the first time in years. An elderly woman approached Thomas, tears in her eyes. "My son was one of the 13, she whispered. "He disappeared in 2008. The police said he ran away, but I always knew. Thank you for finally making someone listen." Thomas gripped her hand, his own eyes wet. I'm so sorry for your loss." Jake stood slightly apart, watching his father connect with the people Kane had hurt. This was what justice looked like, not revenge, not violence, but accountability, truth. The legal system working the way it was supposed to. Margaret Hoffman brought them coffee from the diner. Linda Hayes offered them lunch. Sarah Mills introduced her daughter, who looked at Jake with wide eyes and said, "You're a hero." "No," Jake said gently, "your mom is the hero. She risked everything to do what was right." The ceremony resumed, but this time it was different. This time veterans stood and spoke about real sacrifice, real courage. Thomas was asked to say a few words. He limped to the microphone, leaning heavily on his cane, and spoke quietly about service and duty and the responsibility to protect the innocent, even when it's hard, even when it's dangerous. "Today," he said, his voice carrying across the square, "we honor those who served in uniform. But we should also honor those who serve in other ways, those who stand up to corruption, those who refuse to stay silent, those who protect their communities not with weapons but with courage and truth. You are all veterans of a different kind of war. And you won, you won." The applause was thunderous. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake and his father walked slowly back to their car. Thomas moved carefully, his hip hurting, his head aching, but his spirit lighter than it had been in months. "Your mother would be proud," Thomas said quietly. "She'd be proud of you, Dad. You helped people today. You gave them hope. We gave them hope together, the way it should be." They drove to the hospital so Thomas could be checked again. This time he agreed to stay overnight properly. As Jake helped his father into bed, Thomas gripped his son's hand. "When I fell in that store, when my head hit that counter, you know what I thought." "What?" "I thought, good, now he'll have to care, now he'll have to pay attention, now something will finally change. I knew you'd make it right, because that's who you are, that's who I raised you to be." Jake's throat tightened. "Dad, I'm proud of you, son, not because you're a SEAL, not because you're tough or trained or any of that. I'm proud because when you saw injustice, you stood up. When you saw people suffering, you helped. That's what real strength is. That's what real courage is. I learned it from you." "Then I did something right." Thomas closed his eyes, already drifting. Stay for a while. This town needs someone they can trust, someone who can help them heal." "I'll stay," Jake promised, "as long as you need me." "Good, that's good." 3 months later, spring came to Pinewood Ridge. The snow melted from the mountains, revealing green slopes and wildflowers. The sun stayed out longer, warming the valley, and the town began to heal. Derek Kane stood trial in federal court in Denver. The evidence against him was overwhelming. 17 years of financial records, recordings of murder confessions, testimony from 47 witnesses. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and found him guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 45 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. He would die behind bars. His co-conspirators received similar sentences. Sheriff Porter got 20 years, Mayor Richardson got 15, Judge Morrison got 25. The corrupt deputies were sentenced to varying terms. The entire corrupt infrastructure that had controlled Pinewood Ridge was dismantled piece by piece. The FBI's investigation expanded to include Vincent Russo and his Chicago connections. That case was still ongoing, but agents were confident they'd finally broken the organized crime network that had operated in the Rockies for decades. Joseph Palmer, the Vietnam veteran who'd lost everything to Kane in 1998, was brought back to Pinewood Ridge for a special ceremony. The town formally apologized, returned his ownership stake in the lumber mill, and gave him a key to the city. He stood on the same platform where Kane used to give speeches, tears streaming down his weathered face, and told the crowd, "I thought I'd never see justice. I thought evil had won. But it turns out good people just needed time to find their courage. Thank you all." Sarah Mills was promoted to chief of police, heading a newly formed, fully reformed department with oversight and accountability. She hired deputies from outside the county, people with clean records and strong values. She implemented body cameras, civilian review boards, and transparent reporting. Crime dropped, trust increased. Diane Kane divorced her husband, kept her maiden name, and used her settlement to establish a domestic violence shelter in Pinewood Ridge. She also started a foundation to help victims of corruption rebuild their lives. She visited women's prisons, speaking to inmates about finding courage to leave abusive situations. She said she was finally using her privilege for good. Margaret Hoffman was honored by the governor of Colorado for her bravery. She continued working at the grocery store because she loved her customers, but she also started teaching classes on civic courage at the community college. "Standing up isn't easy," she told her students, "but it's always right." Linda Hayes opened her archive to researchers and journalists. Her 20 years of documentation became the basis for a book about corruption in small-town America. She donated all proceeds to veterans' services. The 13 families who'd lost loved ones to Kane's violence finally got answers. 8 bodies were recovered, memorial services were held. Justice, delayed but finally delivered, brought some measure of peace. The town elected new leadership, people who'd stood up during the arrests, who'd shown courage and integrity. They implemented new safeguards, new oversight, new systems to prevent corruption from taking root again. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that was a start. Jake Cross stayed in Pinewood Ridge longer than he'd planned. He took extended leave from the Navy, citing family needs. He helped the town rebuild. He worked with Sarah to train new deputies. He visited schools to talk about service and courage. He helped his father heal. Thomas Cross moved permanently to Pinewood Ridge, buying a small house with a view of the mountains. His hip healed slowly but steadily. The concussion left no lasting damage. He joined the Veterans of Foreign Wars Post, became active in town affairs, and spent his evenings on his porch drinking coffee and watching the sunset. He visited his wife's grave often, telling her about the changes in the town she'd loved. He was at peace. On a warm day in early May, father and son sat on Thomas's porch, watching storm clouds gather over the peaks. "You need to get back to your team," Thomas said. "They need you, the country needs you. I'm needed here too." "The town will be fine, we're strong now. We remember what we're capable of, you gave us that. Now go do what you're trained to do." Jake nodded slowly. His father was right. The town didn't need him anymore. They needed to walk on their own, to prove to themselves they could stand without someone protecting them. "I'll visit," Jake said, "often. I'll be here, telling anyone who'll listen about my Navy SEAL son who took down a criminal empire with paperwork and patience." Jake laughed. "That's not quite how it happened." "That's exactly how it happened. You could have used violence. You could have beat Kane senseless and probably no one would have blamed you. But you used the law, you trusted the system. You proved that justice works when good people refuse to look away. That matters more than any firefight." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the storm approach. Lightning flickered in the dark clouds. Thunder rumbled in the distance. "I'm proud of you," Thomas said again, "in case I haven't said it enough." "You've said it plenty." "Well, I'll keep saying it because it's true." The storm arrived, rain drumming on the porch roof, washing the town clean. And in that moment, both men felt the presence of the woman they'd lost, the wife and mother who'd taught them both about courage and love and doing what was right even when it was hard.
She would be proud too.
If this story of courage and justice touched your heart, please subscribe for more true stories of veterans protecting their communities. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that good triumphs over evil. And comment below which moment inspired you most. We pray that God blesses every person watching this. We pray for strength for those fighting their own battles. We pray for courage for those facing injustice. We pray for protection for the vulnerable in our communities. And we pray that the spirit of heroes like Jake Cross lives in all of us. If you believe that courage matters, if you believe that one person standing up can change everything, if you believe that God watches over those who fight for justice, write Amen in the comments below. Thank you for being part of this community. Thank you for believing in justice. Stay strong, stay faithful, and God bless you all.